And we're back. Welcome back and happy Thursday. Today, we will talk about the final project. And we will spend next week, both class periods, going over methods useful for your solution to the final project. Before we begin, some administrative bits. Our final exam period is scheduled for Thursday, the 6th of May, in the block of time from 10:30 a.m. to 12:30 in the afternoon. The slides that you will be presenting during that period, and each person will be presenting on their final project, those slides are due the evening before, Wednesday, the 5th of May, at 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. So you'll be giving each a presentation on your final project during the scheduled exam period, about 8 minutes, and those slides will be handed in via Blackboard the night before. The actual final solution to your project, everything, including the code, as well as your project report, will be Friday, the last day of finals, the 7th of May at 5 p.m. Please make sure you're noting 5 p.m., not 11:59 and 59 seconds. This will be on Blackboard. Make sure you are not waiting until the last minute. Manage your time. Do not email me anything. Do not attach your project and email it to me. I'm not going to look at it. It clogs my email. And when you submit your project, submit a zip file or a link to your zip file on cloud storage. Please make sure you follow instructions. If you do not follow instructions, you will lose points. So follow instructions. You know who you are. All right. So why don't we begin? So we talked about Rgb Color Space during the semester to describe the special data, namely an image, and Rgb Color Space refers to how you represent colors in an image, a so-called RGB image. And each color represents a mixture of three principal colors: red, green, and blue, hence the name RGB, and the amount of red, amount of green, and amount of blue corresponds to a point in this RGB color cube. Along the main diagonal is a gray level from black to white, but all mixtures that are not equal are represented as some color depicted in the cube. And so we talked about the data structure for an image. An M row by N column image is represented by an M by N by 3D array. And so in this 3D array, that third dimension of rank 3, the first part or slice of that three-dimensional rank is the red values, or the red mixture. The second slice is the green mixture. The third slice is the blue mixture. Now, these slices are also called color channels or color plane, and we experimented with this in MATLAB. And so we talked about appearance-based features, and appearance-based features were the combination of color and shape. And how we represent color, if we're doing RGB representation, is we take the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel, and we compute the distribution of the saturation for each one of those channels. And so when we do so, let's assume we had 10 bins for histogram in this visualization of the distribution. We concatenate those bin counts, and together that would form a 30 vector for our images. And so here we have an image of a building scene, we have an image of a sunflower scene, and because the color composition of each one of these images is different, so too will be the 30 vector representing the bin counts from the red, green, and blue color channel histograms. And so we also then talked about edge extraction. And we said we treated an image as a relief map, and then we derived from the definition of the derivative an expression that was represented as a set of coefficients inside of a mask that we slide across the image and multiply by the intensity value at each location in the image beneath this mask. And so we call this mask a convolution mask, and this convolution operation is the weighted sum of the image intensity values across the image weighted by those values that are in the mask. And so when you compute this convolution, that's akin to computing the derivative at the center point underneath in the image underneath this convolution mask. And so this results in the local slope of the intensity surface along the scan line in X, and we can do that along Y direction in image coordinates to compute the derivative components in X, that partial with respect to X, of the intensity function, and the partial derivative with respect to Y of the intensity function. And so to make this more robust, we repeated that convolution to get three gradient points, one in a row, one next to the other, to represent a tiny little edge. And we do that and clean up the convolution mask. We don't need that half, so we multiply all values in our triple replicate of our convolution mask by 2, and we get this thing we call a central difference operator. And so the central difference operator gives us more robust edges by taking the derivative with respect to X or Y at 3 consecutive gradient points for this intensity surface representing our image. And so we can do this operation in grayscale, but we could also perform this operation for each color channel, treating the color channel as if it were our relief map, but it's just one channel of relief map. All right. So we generalized this idea of our partial derivative with respect to X and Y, and we took this central difference from the left side to the right side, or from the top row to the bottom row, and we computed Sx and Sy to represent this central difference, or the gradient with respect to the X direction in image coordinates, or the Y direction in image coordinates. And moreover, we can place a constant on the center value, whether the center row or center column of our 3x3 mask, in order to emphasize the center more than the edges in our convolution mask. And so we can take our gradient with respect to X and with respect to Y, and we can use the L2 norm. So we say Sx squared, like the Pythagorean theorem, plus Sy squared gives us the magnitude of the edge in arbitrary orientation by taking the gradient with respect to X and with respect to Y. You can also calculate the edge orientation by taking the inverse tangent of the derivative with respect to Y divided by the derivative with respect to X. That's like saying slope is rise over run. And it's just the inverse tangent to give you theta, the orientation of the edge. And so this arms us with a description of shape for an image. And so here you can take your images and you can extract the edge angles. So you compute your derivative in X, your derivative with respect to Y, and in each point in the image compute the inverse tangent of X response, Y response over X response, and then you have a set of thetas, angle thetas, for each center pixel location within the image. And so now we can take that edge orientation map and compute a histogram, and that histogram will represent the distribution of all the edge orientations in the image. And in fact, the modes or the high points in this edge angle distribution are going to be the dominant edges in the image. So, for example, in this building image on the left-hand side, upper left of this slide, we see that there are a lot of horizontal edges and vertical edges. So for the corresponding edge orientation histogram distribution, we're going to see peaks over 90 degrees and 180 degrees, because those are the most frequent edge orientations corresponding to the horizontal and vertical edges for these buildings in this image, for this building. And so here we have our appearance-based feature, and you can collect 10 bins and now form a 10 vector. And so using color and shape, we take our 30 vector corresponding to color, and we take our 10 vector corresponding to shape, and we put them together, and this gives us a vector of rank 40 in 40 dimensions, where each of these features represents, for the first 30 features, these counts from the 10 bins of histogram for the red channel, green channel, blue channel, and then an additional 10 bins from the edge orientation distribution or histogram. And so here we have now a 40 vector, and now the task at hand that we're going to use our appearance-based feature for is, drumroll, image clustering. And so why exactly is image clustering useful? That's a great question. Well, when I was a kid, you had film and not so much digital photography, And you'd buy your roll of film for maybe about $5 to $10, depending on the quality of the film, the speed of the film, and the number of exposures. You'd put it in your camera, and you'd take some snapshots. Now, in those days, you would kind of hold your shot. You wouldn't just willy-nilly take snapshots because it was a lot more expensive in general to run a camera. And so you'd buy your film, then you'd take it into a drugstore that did film processing, and you'd pay like another maybe $5 to $10 for your film processing, and then you would come back 2 weeks later, and you'd pick up your prints, and you were stuck with it because you took the pictures, you pay for the processing, regardless of what shots you had. So you didn't really have a way to review your shots and say, well, let me take that again, or let me not take the shot because I don't like how it's going to look. You were just stuck with this picture that you paid for, and then you'd put them in some photo albums, which would then cost another $10 or $20, depending on the size and page count in the photo album. And so that's how it was all done. And then now we have the advent of digital photography. Now, of course, with digital photography, the average person can conceivably take dozens, literally tens of shots a day, and then after the fact, you download them to your computer, and some applications you can synchronize them wirelessly via the cloud. But nonetheless, it's not inconceivable for a typical person to have many thousands upon thousands of images in your image library on your computer. And so you have a huge photo library, all sorts of images, and let's imagine you want to cluster them or organize them into groups. So once this clustering algorithm converges, you take your groups and you examine them for analysis and name them. And so in this case, you have images of dogs, you separate them based on their appearance, and then these groups, this first group you might call yellow labs, this next group might be the pugs, and this last group are the German shepherds. And so the idea then is to organize your photographs into groups which are much smaller than the thousands and thousands upon thousands of images you have in your library. And these groups are easier to manage, and they're named by you. So you can say, aha, these are my vacation photos, or these are, for example, my photos of my university, or things like that. All right, so the idea then is to select images of different categories and build a database that you can work on. And now I'm providing the database for you, but it's still useful to see where these image databases come from. And so the question then is, where do I get a large number of images? Well, you get them from computer vision databases. And computer vision research in machine learning is very active, a lot of interesting things being done. And one of the things that the scientific community enterprises to do is to provide public benchmark data sets that you can use to compare your algorithm's performance against other algorithms. And so computer vision researchers often create and share databases of images to allow others to reproduce research results. So it's a good thing. And so you can use it to benchmark algorithm performance. How well or how fast are your algorithms running? You can perhaps lower the barrier to entry for performing research because it is a major undertaking to build a data set. You could also produce data sets to facilitate solutions to important problems. Maybe recognizing faces in a certain context is difficult, so you build a database, put out a challenge, and people will pick up your data set and use it to try to solve that challenge. And so this is an example of an image from a face recognition database. And in this particular case, it was taken under ideal conditions. You're in a studio, you have ambient lighting, it's full frontal picture of the face, and you can see a lot of important features are extracted. It's easy to do around the chin, the mouth, the eyes, landmarks in the nose, and so forth, in order to build models for what it is to recognize or perhaps detect the face. Now, of course, in the real world, people don't walk around full frontal with perfect lighting, ambient lighting. It's a lot different when you're in the wild. And so, for example, one group at UMass Amherst created a database called Labeled Faces in the Wild. Now, of course, when someone is out and about in public, they're not facing front, right? It's not perfect. Maybe an ear is not visible because their head is partially turned, for example, and there's also a background, there's other stuff behind them. And so one of the solutions that they set out to address at UMass Amherst when they created Labeled Faces in the Wild data set was this idea that things look different when they're out and about in the public. And this is on, in particular, has public figures in, quote unquote, in the wild. And so here's an example of a database, the Caltech 256 data set. It's very popular. It's been widely used in many computer vision research projects. And it has a total of 30,607 images across 256 different categories. What categories? All sorts of categories. Here's an example. It has 102 dog images of various sorts of dog, 84 images of giraffe, 102 images of bears in different types of natural scenes. And so the first thing you're going to do is implement your features. And so we said, and this is repetition, that an appearance-based feature consists of two components. It consists of color description, the histogram of RGB, and shape descriptor, that distribution or histogram of the edge orientation map. And so let's take our color representation. Here's a picture of a giraffe. You'd imagine we take the red, green, and blue color channels, compute our histograms using a bin count of 10 each. And the question then we might ask is, what is the impact of more bins? Well, if you have more bins, let's say going from 10 bins to 20 bins, what happens? Well, certainly your bin count increases. Instead of 30 bins, you're going to, or rather 30 feature vectors for this appearance, this color representation. You're going to have twice that, a 60 vector. So you're going to have 20 bins of red, 20 bins for green, and 20 bins for blue. Now, of course, with the bins, what happens is that the range of values in red, green, and blue represented by each bin, if you increase to 20 bins, that's going to be a smaller range of values. So what does more bins mean? It means that you have smaller variations in color that you're going to represent, because these bins are sensitive to a smaller range of different color values. And so what does this mean? It means perhaps that when you have a representation of giraffe images, maybe you're going to distinguish among different giraffe pigmentations. For example, an increased bin or more fine resolution representation might represent light brown, dark brown, and medium brown as different colors, because you're going to have different counts in your smaller or narrower bins. And so the natural next question then is, what is the impact of having fewer bins? And so let's say we went from 10 bins to 5 bins. So we cut the bin count in half this time. And so, of course, if you go from 10 bins to 5 bins, instead of a 30 vector for your color representation, you're going to have a 15 vector. And so you have 5 bins of red, 5 bins of green, and 5 bins of blue. So you put them together. And so by the sheer fact that you have a smaller number of bins, that means each of those bins is going to cover a broader range of different intensities in the red, green, and blue color channels. So what does that mean? It means you're collapsing a broader range of, for example, pigmentations into a single representation. And so dark brown, light brown, and medium brown might just be categorized as brown because it's all in the same bin, whereas before, when you went to 20 bins, these different shades of brown were in different bins. And so this less specificity, more general, is afforded by having a small number of bins, which means that each bin represents a broader range of intensities in red, green, and blue. And so let's take a look at the edge angle. Similar deal here. If we take our edge map and we have more bins, that means you're going to have smaller variations in edge angles represented. So certain edge orientations like 35, 45, 55 degrees, they're all represented differently in terms of the counts that you see or feature vector values represented by the bins counts that you're representing. But if you have fewer bins, well, each bin is going to represent a broader range of angles. So in essence, you're going to be collapsing edge angles to be more coarse-grained. And so angles like 35, 45, 55 degrees might just be categorized as slanted. It's all in the same bin, whereas with more bins, they would be in different bins and show up differently. And so similar to what we saw with color, we have that same effect about specificity with more bins and more general with fewer bins. Now, of course, depending on the images that you have, you're going to want to, and that's part of your experimentation for the final project, is trying to figure out what is the best representation to use. And so if you have your objects, and let's imagine we have a round object like this baseball, and we have something that has more straight edges, like this house. Now, of course, if we take a look at this baseball and we track the edge, round things tend to have a more uniform distribution over the edge orientation histogram, because you have many of the different angles that are represented as you draw these edges together that trace around the edge of your round object. And so round things tend to have more uniform distribution over edge angles. And so if you represent more different types of edge angles in your representation for shape or your edge map, i.e. more bins, you're going to be better at recognizing round things. Let's contrast this with engineered objects like this house. They tend to have very crisp, straight edges, not at really funky angles, but a small number of angles represented. And so you use fewer bins for engineered objects because they tend to have peak distributions over edges. So let's take, for example, if we were looking at the edges for this gable on the house, you're going to have an angle like this along the left-hand edge and another along the right-hand edge. So you're going to have a small number of dominant edges. And so that just says fewer bins because you care about the relative orientation among a smaller set of edges in your image. And so fewer bins would lend itself to engineered objects, just like we had that building scene where you had horizontal and vertical edges at 90 degrees and 180 degrees. All right. So you can have more sophisticated shape features. Let's imagine you computed the edge orientation map for this giraffe image, and you compute your gradient along y, your gradient along x, take the inverse tangent, and you get your edge orientation. So then you compute that distribution. That distribution is without respect to relative relationship in the image. And so you form your 10 vector, but another thing you can do is so-called local shape. Now with local shape, you're not just depicting the edge orientations, the distributions, you're looking at the relative relationship, the fact that a particular set of edge orientations is next to or some spatial relationship to another. Take, for example, the left eye and the right eye of this giraffe. You want to know that some distance away, there's another set of edge orientations. And so with this local shape descriptor, you're going to compute the shape, but you're going to do it for a tessellated version of the image. So let's imagine then we divide this image into cells, and then for each one of the cells, we compute this edge map, edge orientation. We take the gradient along x and gradient along y, then we compute the inverse tangent, and then we compute that distribution of edges, the histogram edge orientations for each one of the cells, and we concatenate them row major or column major. So we go top row, first, second, third, fourth, next row, first, second, third, fourth, and so forth down to the last row, first, second, third, fourth. And so if we do that, we list out all of our 10 bins for our 10 histogram, where that histogram, each one represents the distribution of edge angles for each one of these tessellated regions in a particular schedule across the image, left to right, top to bottom. And so if we look at this, well, we have 4 by 4, so that's a total of 16 histograms, each one of which contributes 10 bins for each of those cells in our tessellated image, and that results in a 160 vector. So while we increase our ability to distinguish by adding this idea of relative relationship among the edge orientations for patches or regions in the image, we also, the bad news is, we seriously or significantly increase the size of the representation. We go from 10 bins for the global to 160 vector for this local. So the cost you pay is in the dimensionality. All right. So let's take a look at a kind of happy medium, so-called hog features or histogram of oriented gradients. And what we do with hog feature is we divide the image into cells, and their default is 8 pixel by 8 pixel. And then you take each one of these cells and you define a block, m by n cells per block. In this case, it's a 2 by 2 cells per block. And then you take your block and you position it in the upper left-hand corner of the image, and then you're going to slide that block to the right as well as down over all locations in the image. Now, when you do this, your block occupies a position from the first time instant, we'll call that block 1, to the second time instant, we call that block 2. In this particular case, one of the concerns is how much these blocks overlap. In this particular case, when you slide the block to occupy position from block 1 to block 2, it's an overlap of 50%. And so you keep doing the sliding again and again and again, and you compute the edge gradients for each cell within a block. And so how you do this is you sort of collapse what it means to have edges within a 2x2 block in this case. So each cell in a particular block location is going to vote, and this voting is based on an edge orientation histogram. And so this biggest count that you get from this vote defines a winning orientation, and therefore is the edge magnitude for that particular block. So if we look at this edge orientation histogram, you'll notice it has a wedge. It has 9 bins covering from 0 degrees to 180 degrees for edge orientation, and each bin represents a 20-degree region. And so you take your edges, and each one of these cells is going to vote based on this bin, and then whichever of these 9 bins, it's going to be a single histogram for each of the cells in this 2x2 block. Whichever one has the highest count is going to be the winner, the winning edge orientation. All right, so we do this, and for each position of the 2x2 block, we're going to have a different histogram resulting from this vote. And so we're going to have quite a few of these histograms, because if this block is overlapping a lot, you're going to have a lot of different positions representing the best of both worlds. And so this idea of voting, that adds a little bit of generalization, but the fact that you have this block that's overlapping, that adds consistency from one position to the next in the image, but also you're getting a local representation. And so it's a more robust local representation from the approach that we describe, where you tessellate the image and just concatenate the histograms for each one of the cells. All right, so this is an example of Hogg features, histogram of oriented gradients. Let's take this image on the left-hand side, and this is somebody walking on a dock, and you see there's some water, there are ripples on it, and the person has a jacket slung over his right shoulder. You see his left leg here, you see his right leg here, and then you see one of the crease for his legs there and his arm pointing down at an angle. So if we take a look at the Hogg features, you'll notice here a bundle of edges. These are the top K edges in terms of strength resulting from this vote. And so if you look at the dominant edges here, here we have an edge that's the same angle as that arm. And then if we look at this leg, this hip here, here we see the hip of the person, and then we see the side of the leg here, and then we see another side of the leg here, and then we also see here the jacket slung over the shoulder, that part of the jacket, this part of the jacket. We also see the ripples on the wave, right? They're on the water, they're this way. And so we see a lot of dominant edges show up in the Hogg feature visualization. Here's another Hogg feature, someone standing at what looks like a beach. They're wearing a jacket, and you see their right arm here, their left arm extended there. You also see the waist of their coat here, and you see their shins. There's one shin, there's the other, and you see the outline of the thigh. And so here we have the right arm, we have the left arm, we have the hood. We see a little bit of the jacket here. Let's see if we can find the jacket. These are the legs, and this is somewhat of the jacket. And then we see here between the legs here, we see those dominant edges. So this is an example of the response for histogram of oriented gradients. It adds some robustness while being a local feature. Alrighty. So this is the API for extract Hogg features. It's a MATLAB API. And for this, you have to decide some of the parameters. What's the cell size? It has a default. What is the block size? The amount of overlap between blocks when you slide that block to compute that voting histogram. And then the trade-off that you're making when you choose these parameters are between speed and specificity. If the block does not overlap as much, it's faster and it's a smaller representation. If the block overlaps quite a bit with the next block position, then it's going to take longer to run, and you're going to have much more specific features, a higher dimensionality. All right. So what is the ask for the final project? Well, you're going to be given an image database, a very simple one, 15 images from each of 3 categories for a total of 45 images. And they're going to be drawn from 3 categories, apples, dogs, and pineapples. And they're all going to be on white backgrounds. Now, the goal for this project is for you to design an appearance-based feature descriptor that's color and shape, and to then perform k-means clustering using Lloyd's algorithm. Now, of course, you're not going to be implementing Lloyd's algorithm. You can use MATLAB's API call, which we covered last module, for the customer partitioning problem for understanding customers. And so again, Lloyd's algorithm, you select some centers, and then you randomize the assignment of your data points, which would be your feature vectors for each one of your images in the database, all 45 of them. You assign them randomly to clusters, and then you minimize the clustering compactness objective function. You do that as an iterative algorithm that alternates between updating the center and reassigning the points to the cluster with the closest center. And so you keep going back and forth until convergence, either some fixed number of rounds or you have no more changes. And so, as we did before, this is the API call for Lloyd's algorithm, k-means clustering. When you do the clustering, the version of this API call that has 2 return types, the indices and the cluster centers, is what you'll be using. You're welcome to experiment with the others, and you'll be deciding the number of iterations, the initialization, the distance measure you use for determining similarity, as well as the number of clusters. And so as you experiment, you'll notice that the groupings are going to change, so you want to figure out a way to visualize or talk about those groupings, and how do these parameters impact the performance of the results. All right, so then you examine the results. So some questions then. How did your algorithm perform? What were your clusters? What name would you assign your groupings? Of course, you could try grouping of 3 because it's apples, dogs, and pineapples. But what happens when k is smaller? What happens smaller than 3? What happens when k is larger than 3? What would you name these groups? How did these groups look? And so how does the performance change as you modify your experimental parameters? If the feature representation changes, also if the number of clusters changes. If you tinker with the distance measure, it's also going to change the way your clustering results come out. And so what would you or could you try to do in the future beyond this class to further improve on your project is another thing that will show up in your results and you should write about in your discussion. All right, so in summary, your task is to do image clustering. You're going to input images across 3 categories. You're going to implement appearance-based features, perform k-means clustering by a Lloyd's algorithm. You're going to vary experimental parameters, namely the features and the groupings, and examine and report on the results. So with that, we will end there. That's all I had for today. And as usual, please stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you all on Tuesday.